Go ahead, John.
Okay, well, thank you all for being here, and good morning to those in the US and good evening to our friends in Asia. Since the whole COVID pandemic and the advent of Zoom and Teams meetings, you can't just say good morning or good evening. You have to, have a greeting to reflect every time zone. Anyway. My name is John Goyer, and I'm the Executive Director for Southeast Asia with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. For the past 9 years, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has issued an index that looks in some detail at the intellectual property environment in more than 50 countries around the world. The index measures each country's laws, regulations, institutions, enforcement, and other aspects of the IP environment. And from those measurements, it derives a numerical ranking. This allows us to better understand each country's IP environment, make comparisons between and among countries, and observe trends over time. Why do we do this? Simply put, intellectual property standards create jobs, save lives, advance global economic and cultural prosperity, and generate breakthrough solutions to global challenges. Innovation is vitally important to all our economies. We all continually seek to attract and promote higher value added, high tech intensive, and knowledge intensive industries. These efforts can be successful in robust IP environments, and they falter in the absence of such environments. The COVID-19 pandemic, in many ways, I think really brings this home. Intellectual property protection played an essential, if oftentimes underappreciated, role in the creation and development of treatments and vaccines. During the pandemic, transparent and predictable IP rights have also provided the legal and economic basis for an unprecedented level of cooperation and collaboration between government, industry, academia, and NGOs. The fact is that IP-enabled digital technologies allowed us to remain connected to one another, even if we were physically isolated. And while many of us have spent the past 12, 14, 16 months in quarantine, the development of new streaming services and creative content helped some of us get through it. So with that as hopefully useful context and scene setting, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Kelly Anderson, the Senior Director, Health and Drug Policy of the Global Innovation Policy Center at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Kelly, over to you.
Thanks so much, John. Give me 1 sec to turn on my camera here. Letting me do it.
No.
Oh, you know what? It's not letting me turn on my camera, so you may just get to hear my voice here. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. My name is Kelly Anderson, and I am a Senior Director at the U.S. Chamber's Global Innovation Policy Center. The GIPC is the division within the U.S. Chamber that promotes the ways that intellectual property or IP policy supports innovation and creativity, spurs economic growth, and drives global competitiveness. And I'm so honored to be here today to discuss how IP can support each of these objectives in Southeast Asia. So ASEAN is a real region on the move. When the ASEAN community was formed in 1967, the bloc of 5 countries had a combined GDP of $23.7 billion. Since that time, ASEAN has grown to include 10 countries with over 600 million consumers and a collective GDP of nearly $3 trillion. The community was born from a recognition that working together through economic integration, trade facilitation, and regional harmonization, the trading bloc is more powerful than any one nation alone. And as a result of that integration, the region is set to become the 4th largest economy in the world by 2030. Additionally, the ASEAN region is home to 12 of the world's unicorn startups, sending a signal to innovators and investors alike that the region is a market with tremendous economic opportunity. And this morning, we're here to celebrate the ways that effective IP can help the region leverage their dynamic economies, growing populations, and innovative capabilities to become one of the most competitive trading blocs in the world. For businesses large and small, from unicorn startups to Fortune 100 companies, intellectual property provides legal certainty that high risk, high capital investments will be protected in markets around the world. We are really living in an era of unprecedented technological progress, and never has that been more clear than over the last year. As John mentioned at the outset, as communities around the world entered into lockdown last March, global consumers clung to the hope that science could deliver solutions and return our lives to normal. And in less than a year's time, the science really did just that, with multiple effective therapeutics and vaccines developed to combat COVID-19 in just 10 months. And while the scientific community worked day in and day out to develop these solutions, technological innovations allowed us to work remotely, teach virtually, and remain connected, even if in isolation. And the entertainment, publishing, and arts communities churned out new content to enrich our lives as we all adjusted to our new normal. So, I think we've really seen over the last year that we can do so much now that we could never
You getting
do
around? Okay.
And none of this would have been
Good
possible
morning.
without effective IP protection. The ASEAN region has really recognized the powerful role IP can play in enabling progress. The ASEAN Economic Community Blueprint 2025 discusses the important contributing role that intellectual property will play in stimulating innovation and creativity, encouraging technology transfer, and promoting the region's socioeconomic development goals. The innovative, creative, and technological communities stand ready to help achieve these goals because, our industry's ability to bring cutting-edge technologies or breakthrough innovations to global markets is contingent upon governments creating an enabling environment through strong IP laws. And at the GIPC, one of the primary tools that we use to help us assess the strength of those IP laws in global markets is our International IP Index. So we started this report back in 2012 because we fundamentally believe that if you can't measure it, it's really hard to improve it. So we saw a need to create a rigorous academic tool to benchmark the IP framework in global markets in order to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of countries relative to their neighbors and trading partners. In 2012, we began with just 11 economies. We're now in the 9th edition of the report, which benchmarks 53 global markets representing nearly 95% of global GDP. It benchmarks the laws and practices in these countries against 50 indicators in 9 different categories. Each indicator is worth 1 point for a maximum score of 50. We created these indicators in collaboration with industry as those that they believe are indicative of a robust IP system. And the theme of our 2021 index is recovery through ingenuity, because our research really shows that when countries make a conscious policy choice to invest in a more effective IP ecosystem, we can harness innovation for good to control COVID-19 and really restore our world to health. And this is going to be key to restarting the regional and global economy in a post-COVID-19 world. So the 2021 index illustrates that many countries are actively recognizing the value of more effective IP protection. In the 9th edition, 32 of the 53 economies benchmarked had positive improvements in their score. And while high-income economies continue to lead the way on our index, emerging markets, specifically China and Mexico, had the greatest overall improvements in their score in the 2021 report. These gains are in large part a result of the implementation of trade agreements with the United States, and this really illustrates the ways that trade can lead to concrete improvements to national IP frameworks. In ASEAN, we also saw positive reforms to strengthen IP policy across the region. Thailand and Vietnam had the largest overall increases in their score in the 9th edition of the report. In Thailand, this was a result of new measures to disable access to trademark infringing content online. And in Vietnam, the score improved as a result of the ratification of the EU-Vietnam FTA. So we have 7 ASEAN economies included in the index. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is that all of those economies had positive improvements in their score over time, even if that improvement was only marginal. Vietnam boasts the largest overall improvement in score, increasing nearly 11.5% since it was first included in the report in 2012. Likewise, Thailand's score improved a little over 11% since 2014. Similarly, the Philippines and Malaysia also saw notable improvements, with their scores improving over 6% since both economies were first included in the report. And this is really a result of a range of pro-IP forms that we've seen across the region. So this includes in Vietnam, the government introduced greater penalties for commercial scale IP infringement and increased participation in free trade agreements. In Thailand, the government strengthened enforcement against counterfeit goods online and at the border, increased customs transparency measures, and strengthened intergovernmental enforcement on IP. In Malaysia, the government improved enforcement against copyright and trademark infringement, strengthened border measures, and improved consultation with stakeholders. In the Philippines, the government collaborated with the private sector to combat counterfeit goods online. In Brunei, the government strengthened international cooperation on IP. And in Singapore, the government has invested in improving its really already world-class copyright framework and improved tax incentives for the creation of IP assets. And then finally, in Indonesia, the government recently removed an amendment mandating local manufacturing and forced technology transfer, which was a welcome development. So, I think it's really critical that the region sustain this positive momentum if it is to reach that goal of becoming the fourth largest economy in the world by 2030. However, I think what we've seen is that despite this positive progress, you note that there's one area where we haven't seen much improvement, and that's primarily related to life sciences IP protection. While Brunei, Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam are all signatories to the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP, many of the strong life sciences provisions were removed from the final CPTPP agreement. So there was a missed opportunity to raise the bar for IP protection there. And over the last year, we've also seen a number of negative developments, particularly in light of COVID-19, which is one of the key findings that we highlight in the 2021 report. Around the world, we've seen a handful of countries call for or enact new laws to expand the criteria for compulsory licensing for COVID-19 related medicines and technologies. These laws, in a proposed waiver at the WTO, were put forth under the misguided assumption that IP rights serve as a barrier to accessing COVID-19 vaccines and treatments, when on the contrary, IP is really what enabled the development of a pipeline of solutions to treat COVID-19. And while 2 of the vaccines authorized for use against COVID-19 use a novel technology, they're results of decades of scientific research, which was made possible by effective IP protection and has now been successfully applied for the first time during the pandemic. And as John noted at the outset, these vaccines were developed as a result of tremendous public-private sector collaboration around the world, which was born from a recognition that the pandemic won't be defeated anywhere until it's defeated everywhere. A strong IP framework is really what's enabled partnership between the private sector, governments, the academic community, and nonprofits. And these IP-enabled collaborations are occurring across markets large and small, from the US to India to Singapore to South Africa. So, I think if there's any hope that we will soon be able to put the global pandemic behind us, it's imperative that we don't undermine the IP framework that really got us to where we are and help deliver solutions to the pandemic. Rather, we must ensure that we continue to protect the global IP ecosystem to ensure that we're ready for the next global public health threat, whenever that may be. So I briefly wanted to come back to the point earlier about why it really matters that governments invest in effective IP frameworks. Following the ASEAN summit, the governments released a comprehensive recovery framework, which outlines a strategy to restart the region's economy in the wake of the pandemic. The framework notes that strengthening human capital, intensifying trade and investment facilitation, and accelerating inclusive digital transformation across the region will be key to economic recovery. And intellectual property can help support each of these goals as the region seeks to recover from COVID-19. The index shows that the countries with the most effective IP systems are more likely to receive a host of socioeconomic benefits. And this includes more high-value jobs, greater private sector investment in R&D, increased foreign investment, and greater growth in the dynamic content and media sectors. So with effective IP protection in place, that goal of becoming the 4th largest economy in the world is still possible, even if economic growth in the region has slowed during the pandemic. One interesting thing that I took a look at when I was preparing for this presentation is of the top 15 economies with the greatest GDP, 10 of those economies are in the top third of our index rankings. And the remaining 5 in the top 15 for GDP are China, India, Brazil, Russia, and Mexico, have made a conscious policy choice to invest in more effective IP frameworks over the last couple of years. And each of these economies have gradually risen through the index rankings as a result. So should the leaders of the ASEAN community continue to invest in IP protection, that goal of becoming the 4th largest economy by GDP in 2030 may well be within reach. Because ultimately, I think the bottom line is this. What we see is that when countries invest in IP protection, the economic benefits are real. So the Chamber looks forward to working with the leaders of the ASEAN community to ensure that IP-driven innovation and creativity can propel the region to becoming one of the most competitive trading blocs in the world. So with that, there we go. Now my camera works, of course. Thank you for the opportunity to present the report. I'd now like to welcome John Goyer back to the virtual stage to lead our distinguished panel with foreign government officials.
Thank you, Kelly. Thanks very much for that. As always, your presentations are insightful and incisive, and I will look forward to the comments from our government panelists. So we are pleased to have with us this morning and this evening IP officials representing the governments of Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines. I'll introduce each briefly. From Indonesia, we have Ibu Dede Mia Yusanti from the Ministry of Law and Human Rights. Ibu, it's good to have you with us again, and I want to thank you particularly for your partnership and engagement over the past several years on Indonesia's patent law and related issues. We appreciate it very much. Since October of 2017, Ibu Dede has served as Director of Patents, Integrated Circuit Layout Designs, and Trade Secrets at the Directorate General of Intellectual Property at the Ministry. She's held a number of different positions within the ministry over the years, including as Director of IP Cooperation and Empowerment, and in deputy roles overseeing foreign cooperation, IP development, and patent administration services. She was chief negotiator for IP chapters in several of Indonesia's trade agreements, and she serves as Indonesia's delegate to a number of regional and multilateral meetings and forums on IP-related issues. Representing the Philippines, we have Nelson Laluches, Deputy Director of the Intellectual Property Office of the Philippines. He was a practicing lawyer before he joined government service and held the position of Director of Legal Service of the Department of Tourism, where he was posted, among other places, in Sydney, Australia, as Tourism Promotion Officer of the same department. Before his appointment to the Intellectual Property Office, Attorney Laluches was chairman of the Land Transportation Franchising Regulatory Board, a regulatory body which promulgates, administers, enforces, and monitors compliance to policies, laws, and regulations regarding public land transportation services. And from Thailand, we have Kun Suket Buribunsri, Head of Bilateral Cooperation, Office of International Affairs in the Department of Intellectual Property at the Ministry of Commerce. He previously worked in the Copyright Office at the Department of Intellectual Property and has served as the counselor at the Permanent Mission of Thailand to the World Trade Organization and the World Intellectual Property Organization. Earlier, he worked in private practice at a local IP law firm and an international IP law firm based in Bangkok. Thank you all for being with us. I'm going to ask each of you to give 3 or 4 minutes of comments on your country's IP environment, any reactions you might have had to the presentation, and then I'll ask a series of questions, but we'll also open it up to the audience, who I will encourage to weigh in with their questions and comments as well. And so now let me first turn to Nelson for a perspective from the Philippines. Attorney Laluches, please go ahead.
Hey, thank you very much, John. and good day to everyone. First off, congratulations to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce for being able to complete the IP Index 2021 despite the challenges of the first pandemic year. We are very glad that the index recognized our advancements last year in strengthening enforcement in the online space despite heavy mobility restrictions here in the Philippines. Specifically, it noted our work in updating our 2013 rules in the exercise of our enforcement functions and visitorial power. We are delighted to share with you that these rules were approved and have been enforced since March this year. Specifically, the new rules expanded the remedies of our enforcement office uh, the, to IP right holders, as we can now order the removal of counterfeit goods or pirated content, including advertisements in relation to such goods or content, or the blocking of access thereto in coordination with the appropriate agency, body, or intermediary service provider. We can now also issue a cease and desist order the removal of counterfeit and pirated goods or content from physical establishments, and endorse to pertinent government offices the cancellation of permits and licenses of businesses engaged in counterfeiting and piracy online. So I hope that through this development and the many more programs and initiatives that we are working on this year, such as the digital transformation of IPO field services, significant reduction in the turnaround time of certain IP applications, and reforms on the legal infrastructure, the Philippines will have a more positive standing for the next round of the survey. Without a doubt, the intelligence the report provides on a nation's IP landscape is helpful to investors in determining the IP-friendly countries that will safeguard their IP assets for their full benefit. Given its impact on the decision-making of investors, we at IPO Field would like to work more closely with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to ensure a fuller and more balanced view of the Philippine IP landscape. We are more than happy to provide you the information to support your work at the Chamber where protecting IP rights is concerned. In turn, we look forward to discussing more in-depth the merits of the report so we can identify the specific areas that may need improving. I hope this virtual launch today is the start of a greater collaboration between governments and the Chamber toward a balanced assessment of the IP environment in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Attorney Leluches. And now let me turn to our colleague Kun Suket from Thailand. Kun Suket, please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, John. First of all, I would like to say thank you, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, to invite me to join the panel discussion today. And I, of course, delight that the International IP Index identified the better score for Thailand for this year. I also note that in the International IP Index report this year identified the strength and the weakness of the IP system in Thailand. But at this time, I think I would like to actually update you about the recent development of IP in Thailand. I would like to emphasize that the protecting intellectual property in Thailand is a very top priority of the loyal Thai government. And a number of measures have been taken and implemented to ensure that the IPR of domestic and foreign entrepreneurs, investors, and SME are protected and enforced effectively. During the COVID-19 pandemics, the DIP has made adjustments to ensure that IPRs continue to be protected and enforced, and thus facilitating the trade and investment in the country. For example, the DIP issues the practical guidelines to allow users to continue to use the IP registration service easily. The DIP also implement a smart DIP project aimed at promoting use of digital technology to facilitate IP legislations. For example, the online dispute settlement service, the e-certificate service. Regarding the enforcement, the Thai enforcement agency are continuing to enforce the IPRs in both physical and online markets. Despite the COVID-19 outbreaks, the physical markets in Thailand have been monitored. During the 2020, the enforcement actions did not identify any infringing activity in most shopping areas and markets in the country. In addition, several initiatives and mechanisms for combating the online infringement are also taken. These include the MOU on IPR protection on the internet, the strengthened site blocking mechanism under the Computer Crime Act, the establishment of the Police Cyber Task Force, the establishment of the Online Infringement Suppression Group in the DIP. Other recent initiatives to ensure the IPR protection also include the issuance of the government procurement guidelines on legitimate software, the issuance of code of conduct for collecting CMO, collecting society or CMO, and the establishment of the working group on administration of quality of trademark examination and registration. And also the establishment of the working group on driving the development of the patent office operations. And the last one is the revision of the guidelines on trademark examination. Furthermore, the DIP also continued to make significant progress on the amendment of IP laws, including the patent and copyright laws. I think these are about the overview that about the recent IP development in Thailand that I would like to add to the information available in the International IP Index report. And now I would like to turn the floor to you, George.
Thank you, Kun Suket. That was a very helpful overview, and appreciate the update. Let me now turn to Ibu Dede from the Ministry of Law and Human Rights of Indonesia. Ibu, thank you again for being with us, and I turn the floor to you. I think your microphone is muted, Ibu.
Okay.
Okay, very good.
Okay. Okay, first, please allow me to present the Director General's speech, because he could not join us in this meeting due to another important meeting he has to attend, because previously he's supposed to come and join with us. First of all, I would like to extend my warm welcome to all participants in this forum of the Intellectual Property Index Virtual Launch 2021 today. Even during a global pandemic situation that forced us to use such technology to cope these challenges. I hope this forum will be as an exchange experience and fuse forum among USA partners in ASEAN and ASEAN for the sake of getting the benefit of IP protection in the region, including also exchange views on IP development in the ASEAN countries participating in this forum. So today, the world economy is already in the era of Industry 4.0 toward to 5.0. Intellectual property provide the foundation upon which innovation is shared, creativity encouraged, and consumer trust reinforced. But the digital world poses a new challenges. The importance of IP protection fluctuates in a different part of the world. Almost every country which depends on international trade, so including Indonesia, is taking strong measures to protect their intellectual property rights. Strong IP rights make a huge contribution, of course, to both of the overall economy of the country and their respective state. Indonesia has issued the job creation law on November 2nd, 2020, and came into force on that date. The job creation law is foster investment and create jobs by streamlining regulation and simplifying the process to improve the ease of doing business in Indonesia. The job creation law revises various provisions in cross-sectoral laws, including new patentability criteria for simple innovation, the grounds and procedure for compulsory license, and shorten the time for final decision of simple patent application as well as the trademark application. In Indonesia, simple patent is as important as normal patent, as a normal patent. Industry and university also use simple patent to protect their innovation to expedite the process. Even though they are applied through simple patent application, it does not mean that their innovation do not have a high value. Many of them have a quality and economic benefit which are not less than normal patent. And the most interesting provision in this law of job creation related to patent is provision related to local manufacturing requirement, which is now including also the importation and licensing. The Directorate General of Intellectual Property, in responding to the government policy, has quickly conducted breakthrough steps to maintain DGIP's work performance so that it can continue its contribution to the nation and serve public, as well as obtain profits to support economy stronghold during the pandemic COVID-19. Such as the establishment of Virtual Counter 2020 or LOCVIT 20 in adapting with the closing of the DGIP counter. LOCVIT 20 has proven to be able to increase the non-tax state revenue gained from the intellectual property application during the pandemic COVID-19. All DGIP services are now available through online system, and this is appreciated mainly by the customer since it provides easier and cheaper IP application procedure to DGIP. Indonesia also just issued the government regulation on royalty for music to ensure the optimal distribution of royalty to creator and the owner of the related rights. So it just issued a month ago. Ladies and gentlemen, in relation to Global Innovation Index 2021, Indonesia is in rank 48 from 53 countries. No change or improvement from the previous index actually. We would like in this occasion to again convey our disappointment for this result, since we see that there are many data are not updated, and we found also unclear criteria mentioned in the index. This situation is actually has been conveyed to the US Chamber previously, and it seems nothing changed until now. We therefore invite the US Chamber to discuss with us to clarify the information and the data provided. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Ibu Dede. And I think perhaps later on in this session, I can ask my colleagues in the Chamber's Global Innovation Policy Center to respond to the last point that you have raised. In the meantime, what I would like to do is put a couple of questions to the panelists, but also encourage those listening in to ask questions as well. And I think you can just use the raise your hand function or the chat function, and I will try to get to all the questions as best as I can. Let me start with a question that I think would go to both Kun Suket and Attorney Leluches, which is that both the Philippines and Thailand have expressed interest in the CPTPP. And as I understand it, Thailand has taken out or undertaken a number of feasibility studies. And I understand that the Philippines is also doing some of that kind of analytical work. So the question is for both of you, what reforms would you see your countries having to take out if you were indeed to accede to the CPTPP? And maybe Nelson, I can ask you to start with that.
Okay. Sorry. Well, hold on. I'll just turn on the video. Okay. Well, as you said, yes, it's true that the Philippines is not yet part of the CPTPP, although we have written to the New Zealand as a depositary to formally inquire the process under which new economies may become parties to that agreement. And we also have written to Japan as the current chair of the CPTPP to inform that the Philippines is in the preliminary stage of assessing its readiness to participate in the agreement and to seek also Japan's guidance on preparations for the accession process. Well, as to the reforms, we are actually, I understand the chamber also is is aware that we are still trying to, we are considering to commission a study to provide the quantitative analysis of the impact of CPTPP to the Philippines. And internally, we will be assessing gaps between CPTPP rules and Philippine current regimes and other FTA commitments. So as of now, we are not really in a position to state specifically what reforms we would need. But I just would like to also inform that there are several economies who have welcomed the Philippines in our interest to join the CPTPP, such as New Zealand, Canada, Australia, and Chile. And they have offered to engage the Philippines in informal discussions. And probably with these discussions, we would be then ready to share what reforms we need to undergo in order to be able to join the agreement. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, sir. Kun.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, all right. John, you're quite right that we have shown our interest to join the CPTPP and now exploring the possibility on this matter. And I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the cabinet in Thailand now has recently tasked the International Economic Policy Committee, chaired by the Deputy Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, to conduct in-depth studies before making the decision on whether Thailand will join the CPTPP. In short, we are in the process of studying in more detail. And at this stage, I understand that the International Economic Policy Committee appoint 8 subcommittees to study and explore in different areas and report back the result to the committee. So at this stage, I think we are actually exploring and studying. And of course, if we compare the CPTPP to the TPP, which is the previous version, of course, I understand that several IP provisions in the TPP have been suspended. But of course, Thailand now are exploring on those areas and studying in depth and in more detail. So it's rather too early for us to actually say what reform need to be put in place because we are still in the process.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Maybe I can turn to Ibu Dede for a couple of questions. One, you talked about the manpower law, the omnibus, as it's also called. The National Digital Economy Framework that Indonesia has adopted talks about promoting innovation. What measures specific to IP does Indonesia plan in the context of that framework? And maybe a second question related. We talked for a number of years about the patent law, particularly Article 20 implementation, and we ultimately, I think, came to a relatively satisfactory resolution on that. We understand that the overall patent law revision is ongoing. Are there any updates that you could share with that? Thank you. You're muted, Ibu.
Okay. So as you know that we already issued the omnibus law that in principle, actually the omnibus law changed the provision on local manufacturing, which was governed in Article 20 of the patent law of number 13 of 2016. The amendment of the patent law initially based on our intention to amend the Article 20 in this patent law. But you know that because the Article 20 has been changed in the omnibus law or the job creation law, then we postpone a little bit the process of the amendment of the patent law. But after we have a fixed provision in the omnibus law in relation to the Article 20, then we started again our process in the amendment of the patent law. And it is good to inform you that the patent amendment will be is already been included in the national legislation priority for the next year. So we are work hard actually to finish all of the substantive discussion with the other ministries. So far, we also have the discussion, intensive discussion with the European Patent Office, with the other institution in Indonesia, and we have a target to finish all of the discussion and the harmonization in September this year. So the process for the amendment of the Article 20 of the patent law is still ongoing and on the track, because we already put this in the national legislation priority for the next year. Yeah, and then in relation to the economic contribution of the IP intensive industries, we can see actually in Indonesia, as also happened in a number in the world, the number of the IP application in Indonesia is increased significantly, whether for the copyright, the recordation, the industrial design, trademark, and as well as also patent. All the application increase significantly year by year, and the significant increase is in fact contributed also by the domestic application. So we focus now in the domestic application to encourage the innovation of the country's innovators. So the percentage of the patent application from the local increase up to more than 20% compared to 10% a few years ago. And also for the patent application, the highest number application come from university and research institution. But the application from industries also increased significantly. So it seems that our work for to make people aware of the benefit of the IP, we can see the result now because the application are getting higher and higher. There are also the success stories on the effectiveness of the patent protection in supporting their business. Court cases related to patent, which also increased this time, show us the effectiveness of patent protection and the benefit of protection for them. Yes, the court cases of patent also increase as people more aware of the benefit of the patent protection. And then patent from university and research institution also currently show that the patent become more economically benefit for the inventors. So I can give you an example such as the Universitas of Gadjah Mada, one of the leading universities in Indonesia. They have already a good IP management in the university. Their patent application get commercialized, where with their commercialization strategy resulted 33 spin-off companies, 25 of their patents used by industry, and there are also 185 startup companies in the process of incubation. Their product, Genos, is an instrument created by Universitas Gadjah Mada, used widely in Indonesia to identify the COVID-19. And it resulted great economic benefit to Universitas Gadjah Mada. And this product also patent protected in Indonesia. So what we are doing now is try to encourage the innovator to have more and more innovation, because we believe that actually the university in Indonesia, the innovator in Indonesia, they have a potential actually to have more and more innovation. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you, Ibu. There's a question that came in through the chat, which is probably best directed to maybe Kelly, Patrick, or Robert. And that is, it has to do with how the Chamber collects countries' IP-related data for the index, and what's the best means by which countries can submit IP-related information for incorporation into the report. Kelly or Robert or Patrick, can I ask you to take a swing at that?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in there. So the Chamber uses an independent external research firm to benchmark the countries included in the report. And they look at any number of unique data sources. So we look at different laws on the books, different judicial decisions, news media reports, and then various industry sources when we go through and re-benchmark these countries every year. I think the statistic that they gave us is they look at something like 6,000 different data points to come up with the scores for 53 economies across 50 indicators. So it's a quite intensive process. But that said, we obviously know that the folks working in capital have the best information. So one of the things that we do every year is we reach out to the embassies in Washington, D.C. and invite their feedback on the latest indicators included in the report. And just say that we're happy to take any publicly available information into consideration. And there's actually been a handful of times where the embassies have helped us identify things that we hadn't seen yet. Developments on plans to sign on to treaties, for example. So it really is quite helpful to get input from folks in country. And then Ibu Dede, so good to see you again. To your comment earlier, one of the things we also have done with the index is we work with governments to create a series of specific steps where we can work together to improve a country's score and the IP framework. And, you know, to you in Indonesia, to the Philippines and Thailand, we would welcome the opportunity to do that. We've had quite a bit of success in a number of other markets, really working with governments to have a very specific conversation about, you know, the methodology itself and then where we can work together. So would welcome that opportunity.
Thanks, Kelly. That's very helpful. And we obviously encourage all countries that are represented in the report to engage with the Chamber, Kelly and her team on that. Let me ask a couple more questions in the remaining time. I'll have one more question for each panelists. Let me read them off and then I'll ask you to respond in order. First to Nelson. So Nelson, the Philippines, as I think you alluded to, its overall score has improved steadily since 2017. Looking forward, what reforms is the IP office hoping to pass to ensure that the Philippines maintains that trajectory? I guess kind of related to the CPTPP question, but you know, moving forward, what will the priorities be? And then to Kun Suket, Thailand is one of actually a few Southeast Asian economies which receives full credit for its effort to coordinate enforcement of IP rights across different agencies. And those efforts were cited by USTR as one of the reasons that Thailand was removed from the priority watch list back in 2018. So can you say a bit about the government's efforts to promote that cooperation across agencies and how other countries in the region might be able to learn from Thailand's success? And then for Ibu Dede, Ibu, you made reference in the context of your discussion about the manpower law, reforms or changes to the compulsory licensing regime. Could you say a little bit more about that, please? So I'll ask you to answer in the order I asked, so to Nelson first. Nelson?
Yes, thank you very much, John. So the IPO field, in order to well, the reforms that the IPO field is doing now, first of all, is it's pushing for amendments in the Intellectual Property Code or IP Code, which will help the agency address new and emerging issues on intellectual property and keep up with international standards and global trends. So among the proposed amendments, we wanted to have authority to block sites on infringing sites, IP infringing sites. In addition to that, we are proposing that stiffer fines and penalties on IP infringement be provided, and we wanted to institutionalize the IP Enforcement Office of the IPO field. Also, we would like to implement our commitment under RCEP to protect sound marks. That's under trademark. And additionally, we are proposing that there be provisions on provisional patent protection and parallel protection system for invention patent and utility model applications. Also, we wanted to have clear-cut rules on orphan works and the recognition of extended collective licensing. And lastly, we want to institutionalize the IPO field IP Academy and the Bureau of Innovation and Business Development. I understand that we have concerns with the time. I would not go into the details of these proposals, but we hope that these proposed amendments will be favorably considered or acted upon by our Congress, not only to maintain a positive trajectory, but to make significant improvements in our IP system, which can bring in more investments and create employment. That's all. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you, Nelson. Kun Suket.
Sure. Well, the question is so great, and I'm happy that I have a chance to talk about the coordination among enforcement agencies in Thailand. To our experience, to make the coordination among IPR enforcement agencies successful, I think the clear policy on IPR enforcement need to be put in place. That is the first thing. The second thing is that the safe policy need to be top down and implemented by a central body. For Thailand, to ensure the robust coordination and integration of relevant enforcement agency, we have the National Committee on IP Policy, as chaired by the Prime Minister. And the National Committee on IP Policy established the subcommittee on IPR enforcement in particular, and the subcommittee is chaired by the Deputy Prime Minister, responsible for security and crime suppression matter. And the subcommittee plays a major role in developing appropriate measures and overseeing all enforcement operations in Thailand. And to ensure that the work and operations on enforcement are effective, the subcommittee appoint 3 working groups that are the Working Group on Suppression of Intellectual Property Violation. The second one is the Working Group on Suppression of IP Violation on the Internet. And the third one is the Working Group on Destruction of IPR infringing goods. The 3 working groups are chaired by the director of the 3rd Operational Cooperation Center under the Internal Security Operations Command. And the Internal Security Operations Command meet regularly to assess the current IPR infringement situation, to optimize the operation and strengthen tactics being used nationwide. For us, those structures are very important. As I mentioned, 2 things that is very important for the success of the enforcement. One is the clear policy, and the second one would be the structure that can implement the enforcement action. In addition, the DIP ourselves has played a critical role to facilitate the coordination on IPR enforcement among IP right holders and stakeholders. To give you an example on this, the DIP recently established a unit called the Online Infringement Suppression Group, which focused on works related to suppression of IPR violation in the digital environment. One of the tasks of the unit is to ensure the cooperation among all stakeholders, such as internet platforms, IPR holders, online sellers, and buyers, and enforcement agency to strategically fight against online piracy and counterfeit product on e-commerce platform. Those are the things that Thailand has made efforts to ensure the coordination among all stakeholders on their IPR enforcement. I think that's all.
Great, thank you, thank you. And then to Ibu Dede on the compulsory licensing question, briefly, if you could please, and that will unfortunately have to be the last question for this segment. Ibu?
Okay. Yes, thank you. You know that the change of the compulsory license provision is there in the omnibus law as a consequence of the change of the Article 20 of the patent law. So because the Article 20 of the patent law is changed, then the criteria for the compulsory license also has to be changed for the compulsory license provision. So in the amendment of the patent law itself, we also put some additional provision in the compulsory license provision in the draft of the change of the patent law, just to make sure that all provisions are complied with the TRIPS agreement. So we found that there are some articles which are missing in our patent law from the TRIPS agreement. Therefore, we have already put some additional provision to make it comply with the TRIPS. Yeah.
Very good, very good. I want to thank you all again for participating in this discussion. We really appreciate your comments, your insights, and I hope that we can continue to work together closely. We value the partnership with all your governments. So I thank you for your input and insights today. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Robert Grant, for our government panel. Robert is the Senior Director for International Affairs at the Chamber's Global Innovation Policy Center. Robert, all yours.
Thanks indeed, John, and indeed for our government representatives. That was a really terrific panel. I'm delighted to be joined today by a real powerhouse selection of speakers. We have Kit Siri, the IP attaché who's based in Bangkok, with us today. She oversees the whole of the US government's approach to IP in the region. We also have Joni Laura from Qualcomm, who's worked and traveled frequently across Asia as a corporate lawyer for Qualcomm, and now is in charge of global government affairs from the headquarters in California. And Jared Doherty from AT&T, the media and entertainment giant, who spent almost a decade in Singapore looking after the region. Thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon / this morning. So first of all, the elephant in the room, of course, is the pandemic. It's colored all of our existences, not least up-teen numbers of wonderful Zoom conversations. But clearly it's upended life in a very serious way, and no parts of our lives were left untouched by it. You each work in many different markets all across Southeast Asia. So perhaps we could start with you, Jared, with your perspective on where you've seen any changes in IP protection, or the role of governments overall as part of their response to the pandemic when it comes to IP. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And firstly, thank you and congratulations to the Chamber. I think that the work of the Global Innovation Policy Center in this effort is just huge in terms of framing where we stand in the region, and very encouraging to see that the general trend is positive. So that probably should be complemented by a real thank you to all the governments. If you can imagine, when we think about IP law changing as a result of COVID, so many things that the governments have had to do in the past year to step up, to provide safety, to facilitate education, healthcare, business connectivity, and everything. It's really, when you think about the work that the governments across Southeast Asia have done in the past year, it's gargantuan, and it's been tremendously positive and helpful and life-changing. So it's true, we really are seeing progress in this regard. A lot of these things in the IP space we saw beginning maybe even before 2020. So whether it's Malaysia, Vietnam, Singapore, Thailand, or Philippines, who started even after, we see the IP law changing. And a big part of that, I think, is because governments want to adjust the law and modernize it so that it's fit for the technological age that we're living in. If we can imagine managing through COVID without the technology that we have, it's clear why it's so important in the lives of everybody and why updating policies so they can accommodate this era that we're living in is so important. And so I think that by and large, the moves we've seen have been made to do that, but overall, they've really been accelerated by the fact that COVID has made it so tangible to everyone.
Thanks, Joe. That's a great point. Kadishri, could I turn to you next, perhaps with immediate reflections on pandemic response?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank U.S. Chamber of Commerce for giving me this opportunity to talk today. I am very happy to be in the presence of my colleagues in many countries around my region. I have to say that pandemic affects everyone, right? But I'm very impressed. I'm quite impressed with the IP offices in the region that have, faced the pandemic with heads on, and try to quickly adjust to the situation. Most offices such as Singapore, Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia quickly instituted or expanded online filing systems and online services to make it possible and easier for applicants during this COVID-19 restrictions. And many offices also extend the deadlines for document submissions, which is really helpful to many applicants. And, I'm encouraged by hearing reports from different IP offices. So, even when the examiners and officials have to work from home, with very interrupting internet, they manage to increase their productivity when they work from home. And also, in the meantime, reduce the backlog of applications. So looking ahead, I feel like, the IP offices will adjust very well, using the digital technologies to even improve their services more. So with that, I will stop here. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much. Joni, perhaps I can turn for you. Any sort of immediate reflections on how governments are responding when it comes to the pandemic and IP?
Yes, thank you, Robert. And again, thank you for the opportunity to be here to address these really important issues. First, just let me say by way of comparison, our Asian counterparts that have managed to escape the middle income trap, such as Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, systematically cultivate innovation and knowledge intensive sectors, since innovation is key in developing a knowledge-based economy instead of an over-reliance on low skill and labor intensive jobs. So that said, what Indonesia, I'm going to speak to Indonesia and Thailand, what they did just prior to the onset of the pandemic really made all the difference. Indonesia showed that patent registrations and investment in knowledge intensive sectors such as ICT, a strong indicator of innovation in the country. And there was a significant correlation of Indonesia's GDP growth, 10% increase of overall patents granted, correlated with an additional 1.67% of economic growth. It's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, digital economies in Southeast Asia. It had initiated making Indonesia 4.0 a master plan aimed at positioning Indonesia as a top 10 economy in the world by 2030. And 5G is the main catalyst for this master plan. While there are many challenges to fully utilizing 5G, Indonesia has identified these challenges and stands posed to face them. They've defined 5G as a national priority agenda. They stand ready to introduce their new national broadband and connectivity plan to stimulate supply and demand of new services. There are plans to undertake review of the spectrum assignment mechanism, expedite release of key access spectrum, critically important for implementation of 5G, and finally to expand the broadband and digital lifestyle to both suburban and rural areas. Again, prior to the pandemic, Thailand, they made great strides with the Digital Revolution 4.0 and prepared for the implementation of 5G. In addition, Thailand has progressed in making changes in its legal framework, which will bolster its ability to process patent applications and support its 4.0 initiatives. Thanks to understanding that link between prosperity and the commercialization of IP, Thailand also set up a new intellectual property innovation-driven enterprise center, IDE Center, to promote and facilitate the use of invention, technology, and findings from research and development and SMEs to improve their competitiveness. The DIP provided capacity building for more than 1,000 SMEs, and this capacity building resulted in new products qualified for patent protection. They have created an IP mark, which facilitates business between IP owners and IP users. They held an IP fair, IP Powering Change, where IP products were sold. There was business matching and on-site IP registration. Thailand, ahead of the curve, minimized the impact when the pandemic hit, enabled industry to capitalize on the 5G during the pandemic. And we'll discuss probably a little bit later about why that was critically important. A good measure of all of this is the greater number of patent application, the greater the growth in these ASEAN countries, such as Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, with Indonesia experiencing some of the greatest growth. The reward of the patent can promote innovation, and that's never been more poignantly illustrated than with the vaccine in these Southeast Asia countries, and it will allow inventors to earn return and profits from their efforts.
Thanks, Jenny. And it sounds like there were some really important actions taken by a number of governments in the region. So thanks very much for helping fill out our understanding of that. Kadashri, perhaps we can go back to you. We are really grateful that you're able to join our discussion today and provide that US government perspective. I think we at the Chamber and all of our members, both really value the work that you do, and in fact, business wouldn't be able to operate as effectively as it does without your and your colleagues' effort to advance IP protections on the ground. I wonder, perhaps, to give us a flavour of some of that activity, you could be able to share some of the success stories of building more support for an effective IP regime across the region.
All right. Yeah, thank you. One of the roles of the IP attaché, the regional IP attaché, is to encourage improvements in IP policy and laws in the countries in Southeast Asia. So when we talk about a success story, we would look at when the country amend the laws, to comply with international treaties that set the standards for the procedure and for the limits of IP protection and enforcement. So anytime when we see a country join a treaty, a WIPO treaty or IP treaty, we say, oh yes, that's a success, because that is something that we are promoting, and we provide training, and we we review the laws, we point out to the provisions that may not completely be in compliance. So with that, I would say that we have several success stories. In 2019, Malaysia amended the trademark laws and acceded to the Madrid Protocol at the end of 2019, and this was earlier that year. The USPTO and other IP agencies in the US review their laws. We actually trained the drafter of the trademarks amendments, and we brought them to the USPTO and provide training on Madrid Protocol administration. So when Malaysia acceded to the Madrid Protocol, we said, yes, success, right? So, you know, in talking about the Madrid Protocol, you know, Singapore joined in 2020, and now 9 of 10 ASEAN member states are members of the Madrid Protocol. Only Burma is not yet a member. Burma has the IP laws, but they're not in effect yet. But that said, the Madrid Protocol, as you know, allows the applicants to file a single international trademark application for possible obtaining trademark protection in multiple countries. That helps the applicants a lot, right? You can only pay the fees to the International Bureau and possibly obtaining the trademarks in other countries. Vietnam joined the Geneva Act of the Hague Agreement concerning the international registration of industrial designs in December 2009. That's also a success story for us. And, you know, other than the treaties, we also want to point out some success stories in the enforcement efforts. You know, say, you know, you have discussed earlier, our colleagues in the Philippines and Thailand have discussed their success in enforcement. We just want to acknowledge, you know, again, Thailand has really good coordination, enforcement coordination. The whole of the government approach is working for Thailand. And I'm also excited about the Philippines, you know, recent development of the enforcement laws and regulations and the coordination of the enforcement efforts has been really impressive. I get excited when I visit the IPO Phil's website. You know, there would be something happened every day. So that is something to acknowledge that, you know, the Philippines has been doing very well in a good, following a good direction in terms of IPR coordination and enforcement. You know, when we have the Indonesia here, I have to acknowledge Indonesia too, you know, because Indonesia also has a high mark with the Asia Video Industry Association, you know, reported that Indonesia has really good activity or success in reducing access to online pirated contents. So we acknowledge Indonesia too. While I, you know, acknowledge all of this success, you know, we have to also recognize that there are still a lot more things to do. So I would encourage, you know, in Indonesia, you know, we had a training program that we brought, not a training, but roundtable program that we brought Thailand and the Philippines to discuss, you know, their IP coordination efforts. And hopefully, you know, Indonesia will take note and work on the IPR coordination. And that's all I'm gonna say for now. Robert, back to you.
Thanks very much, Khadija. Yeah, great. I mean, there's obviously been a lot of positive progress, but it sounds like you still definitely have a job, Khadija, and plenty more to be done in partnership with a number of those regional economies. Joni, perhaps we can switch you back to you. I mean, I think most folks dialing in understand, I hope, that the index, as well as benchmarking different economies, also includes a statistical annex that illustrates socioeconomic benefits if governments make particular policy choices to invest in IP. Our research illustrates that countries with more effective IP are more likely to see private sector investment in R&D and thereby develop more innovation-driven economies. So Joni, Qualcomm is known as an R&D giant, huge amounts of investment. Can you tell us how effective IP regimes shape what that looks like for Qualcomm in innovation investment across the region?
Well, I can give you a really good example of that very thing. In June of 2020, Qualcomm launched a new R&D facility in Hanoi. And I'd like to say, first of all, that we're quite proud of that Hanoi facility. We have several labs there providing 3 different types of services. We have a 5G lab, is a radio frequency lab. It tests radio chips and design evaluation and calibration. The camera lab has the capability to adjust and test image sensors. The power and performance lab has the capability to test power consumption and performance metrics. Have approximately 35 engineers there that are employed in that office covering customer engineering, that is servicing customer needs that they bring up particular to their products, and customer quality engineering. The team not only supports local Vietnamese customers, but also supports customers from Japan and Taiwan regions, which have manufacturing in the area in Vietnam. Without IP protection, it would not have been possible for QC to risk that investment in the region by locating an R&D facility there. It requires an extraordinary amount of resources to make that investment, both financial and human, research and development to lead through to the breakthrough innovations. Without assurance that the IP resulting from that innovation will be protected and protected in a manner which enables the IP to be monetized, there would be little incentive to risk the huge investment in the R&D. Vietnam has seen success in developing its domestic ICT and electronics industries, and mostly manufacturing. Again, success has been built on large-scale investment, both domestic and foreign. For instance, Samsung, LG, and many other Korean and Taiwanese companies manufacture in Vietnam. Patent filings provide protections needed for this large-scale R&D to take place. We also introduced the Innovation Challenge in Vietnam, which promotes Vietnamese invention and entrepreneurship, small business owners making products in Vietnam, exporting them to the rest of the world, and the business owner is provided IP, ARB training, business training, and development in the digital economy. There are many layers to any technical evolution, and mobile and 5G is no different. Basic research and systems engineering needs to take place, information theory necessary to develop the technology, choosing the best technology to ensure necessary features, for example, backward compatibility, future-proof scalability. Having this foundation drives implementation in software, silicon, and networks at an unprecedented pace. The evolution of 5G resulted in providing fiber-like data speeds, ultra-low latency, and higher reliability. And it provides greater scalability to support billions of connected devices and objects. Per the questions you pose, countries with effective IP systems in place see higher levels of foreign investment, more innovative outputs, greater R&D activity, higher percentage of workers employed in good paying high-tech jobs. You see greater potential to produce and export complex knowledge-intensive products. Healthy IP systems ensure the benefits of innovation and economic growth. That's all I have to say about that.
That sounded pretty comprehensive and persuasive to me, Janie. Jared, perhaps we can learn a little bit more about how AT&T sees things. Our 2021 index shows that copyright protections across the region vary considerably. Obviously, copyright is very important for your business. And while Singapore, where you're based, gets a pretty solid score, I think it's a sort of 3rd out of 53. Rights holders do face significant challenges protecting copyright content in other South Asian countries, as GIPC was explaining, particularly when it comes to piracy devices. Can you give us a sort of AT&T view on where you've seen the most progress to introduce more effective copyright protections in the regions?
I'm happy to. Thank you, Robert. And I think it's good you use the word protection, because that talks about more than just the black and white letter of the law. It really talks about where enforcement comes together. And I'm going to hop in and expand on our attache's early example in a minute, but if you just experience her energy and her intellect, it's easy to see why governments around the region are willing to engage and really to have great conversations. So I think we benefit from your presence here. So thank you for bringing that to bear for the American business community. So I am happy to say also that as reflected in the Policy Center study, there's progress we can report that's pretty positive. And in that regard, it's national governments as well as international collaboration. Both have a role to play in combating piracy, but also driving folks to legitimate sources of content where they can be secure, where they have control over their experience and the content that they put into their household, and sometimes what comes in with that. And so if I could maybe start with a little bit of the piracy ecosystem. If you think back to when some of us were younger, we might have gotten a burned CD or a cassette of a concert from a friend, and we think this is what piracy is. And really it's evolved into these syndicates that are business enterprises in their own right, and often bring with them damage to creators, a lack of tax presence in the country, but also can enter into homes, both malware, spyware, a number of other things, or take people off of these sites into illicit locations that don't bring anything good back into their home or into their computers. So it exposes consumers to a pretty bad place. And so the folks that work against piracy really do work that both helps the economy, but also protects individuals as well. And to expand on the example that was just mentioned with AVIA, AVIA is the Asia Video Industry Association, and they work with a content coalition against piracy group as well. And if we could flash back again to hit a theme which seems to be arising, which is Indonesia. In early 2019, a study reported that 53 million viewers went to streaming sites that were illicit. And for a sense of scale, this is more than twice what went to the top 4 legal streaming sites. So piracy really was clearly an identified issue. And frankly, the government got quite serious about it. And there's a thing that the Coalition Against Piracy does, which is they help with site blocking. And when we talk about site blocking, it's really a mechanism for interrupting websites that are found by courts or other administrative agencies to systemically provide visitors with pirated content. So a number of countries, something close to 36 around the world, have different tools in place to help with this process. And a study of this technique found that what happens when you do this is first, it subtly tells the person going to it that this site isn't legal. And many people, just recognizing that, will go to a site that they can find and access to get the content legally. So just blocking that fosters a good behavior. It also signals the government's view against piracy as well. And so we've seen this deployed in Malaysia, where they've seen a 51% reduction in traffic to pirated sites. The new Philippines IP code aims to help also fast track and implement some rolling site blocking, which is good. But to carry it back to that Indonesia example, since that time in early 2019, they've seen something close to 3,200 different domains blocked in the year that ended in January. And what that did is it translated into a reduction of piracy or access to those sites by 74%, and suddenly growth of 150% to legal sites that respect the laws and the mores and the operations of the country they're in. So I think that's probably, if I were to call it a success story, that's a great one. I would maybe want to add to that, just this week or recently, I would say, they've announced a memorandum of understanding also with the Philippines government. And so working with them to share these practices, which also this week coincidentally was reported, the MOU on IP enforcement and cooperation with the US was also announced. And what this will do is renew the partnership they have in place to work on content protection and enforcement. I think these are some examples of good things that are happening in the region, often building on, like we said, trust and good relationships, and a real sense of the value of legitimate content access to the governments and communities that affect them.
That's terrific, Jared. Thank you. No, these are some very encouraging numbers and developments. Clearly, we all want to make sure that people have access to legitimate content that's high quality, and that all the people and that are behind that are appropriately recognized and rewarded. But then equally, on the flip side, a lot of these illegitimate, illicit sites are involved in lots of sort of often associated with criminal activities. So not only is piracy really bad for the creators, but invariably, most people don't appreciate this. It then channels funds towards other nefarious and illegal behaviors. That makes it even worse. So thanks indeed, Jared. Yeah, Kadishri, perhaps we could turn back to you. We're now about well over 100 days into the Biden administration's time in office. I know that many in industry are very interested in tracking the extent to which the administration will embrace free trade agreements, either enforcing existing ones or looking at new ones to help create a level playing field and sense of reciprocity for those doing business both in the United States and internationally. There have been a number of FTAs signed in recent years by countries across this region, including RCEP, as has been discussed, and CPTPP. Looking forward, what role do you see trade policy playing in bolstering IP protections across Southeast Asia?
Well, I appreciate the question, and when we going to talk about the trade policy, the U.S. trade policy, I'm not in the position to say anything currently, but I can comment on the trade agreements that have been signed in the by members. Countries in the region, such as CPTPP, like we discussed before in the earlier session. CPTPP has been signed by four, including four members of the ASEAN countries: Brunei, Singapore, Malaysia, and Vietnam. But only two countries have ratified the CPTPP. The other two countries, Malaysia and Brunei, they got excited earlier, but now it seems to be like not too excited about joining CPTPP. We kept on asking, when are you going to ratify? When are you going to ratify? But they're not interested at this time, and I don't know the reason. I sort of understand, but I don't know for sure. But that kind of trade agreements are out there, right? And there are some IP chapters in there. CPTPP has a watered down IP chapter, especially on patents, right? But with that, this seems to even Thailand, who is interested in CPTPP, but Thailand has been doing studies after studies after studies from different committees, right? So there's still questions about the IP chapter in CPTPP, even though it's already watered down. But some of the key IP provisions that are of concern for Thailand in particular is the membership of the UPOV, the International Union for the Protection of New Varieties of Plants, which is another form of IP, right? CPTPP requires a membership of UPOV, and countries are saying, whoa, being a member of UPOV will, cause the farmers to, not being able to sell or keep their own seed. So, these countries are agriculture based, so farmers are very important. So UPOV membership requirements is in the IP, well, it's not really in IP chapter, it's in the treaty chapter. That is of concern. And another one is the patent linkage, which survives the suspension. Most other IP patent provisions have been suspended, but patent linkage is still there. But it's also cause concern for Thailand, for instance. They take a look at it and they have to do the study about it many times. So, I'm saying, with trade agreements and IP chapters, how is that going to affect the IP regime in these countries? We don't really know yet. ASEP has very few provisions on IP, right? And the EU FTA has some good IP provisions, but a lot of the provisions are also EU centric. So it depends on what it is on the IP chapter in the agreement. And for the IP regime to be affected by trade agreements, we have to look at what's in it, in details. So that's what I'm going to say right now. Some countries, maybe a little bit more, some countries are really interested in having free trade agreements, but some countries are really wary of free trade agreements for some reasons. So it depends on the countries as well. We cannot talk about the region in general. We just have to talk about different IP chapters in different FTAs, and depends on the country. But overall, though, if countries can join CPTPP, that is something we like to see.
Thanks very much, Katishri. And your views on UPOV are extremely well informed, as some folks know. You worked at UPOV for a number of years, and as well as being a co-patent owner and a research scientist yourself. So clearly you know of what you speak. So it sounds like we shouldn't put too many hopes in the trade basket just now, but it is somewhat unfortunate, I think, that the way some of these issues are considered, when you see it through a trade lens, the sort of working premise is that IP is zero sum. If one country gains, then another loses. But that's certainly not been our understanding. That's not what our IP index research suggests. This is it's all benefit when intellectual property protections are put in place across the world. Joni, I know you have to leave a little early, but so perhaps we can turn to you next. So Qualcomm recently released a really interesting report on the economic impact of 5G. It's of course very central for Qualcomm. And my reading of the study is that 5G could add up to $1.5 trillion to US GDP and create or transform around 60 million jobs. These are obviously pretty big numbers. As countries around the world are looking to restart their economies in the wake of the pandemic, are there legal and regulatory factors that they can put in place, including across Southeast Asia, to harness the benefits of 5G?
Sorry about that, I was on mute. Yeah, well, definitely COVID underscored the necessity of connectivity. We need regulatory schemes in place in the regions to assess the demand and enable infrastructure that's needed to grow and maintain this necessary component of both the urban and rural communities. Qualcomm's been a driver behind that digital transformation, accelerating IoT solutions for smart cities, smart cars, healthcare, education. Inherently, 5G is a secure network. However, when the network is combined with a broader ecosystem of IT infrastructure and connected devices, security needs may change. Regulatory agencies and policymakers must examine new security measures holistically and partner with businesses to balance security's best practices without hindering growth and deployment. Major regulatory and policy concerns can be broken down into two key areas: security and privacy, i.e. cybersecurity and consumer data privacy, and industry-specific regulations. The key will be to streamline 5G employment effectively and transparently to ensure economic prosperity and consumer benefits. Keeping an eye toward the future, regulatory agencies must manage risk and understand the costs of additional regulations to ensure that they don't hinder deployment. To do so, policymakers need to aid in facilitating conversations that highlight the benefits of 5G-enabled technology while alleviating concerns about the risks. Businesses are also aligned with adapting new security systems as needed with 5G deployment. From an enterprise view, the technology framework is already in place for an ultra-secure build-out. Governments must work with them in a thoughtful manner to ensure that data security, collection, and storage concerns are addressed to balance policy and messaging with business goals and consumer needs. Heavily regulated industries such as healthcare and automotive must also face headwinds due to stricter policy and regulatory guidelines established to meet consumer safety needs. Aligning early on with other governing bodies from certain industries regarding 5G expectations facilitates quicker deployment and adoption. To summarize these points, alignment, engagement, and collaboration, then the full value of 5G will be unlocked. 5G will indeed become as pervasive as electricity. You'll simply expect to see it everywhere. Back to you, Robert.
Very much, Julie. That's an exciting prospect, and hopefully it will power our recovery out of this pandemic and long thereafter. Jared, so we talked a little bit about copyright earlier. You know, obviously AT&T's business is very broad. My reading of the index is that countries with effective IP systems have almost twice the amount of online and mobile content and double the access to music and legitimate streaming platforms. And overall, something like a 43% more dynamic ICT sector. How do you think that the business community can work with governments in the region to continue the positive trajectory that supports a more dynamic ICT sector?
Thank you for the question. It's an important one, and it's on probably my favorite thing, which is cooperation, collaboration, and amplifying their impact. And the example that was just used by my colleague from Qualcomm about the decisions they make about where they invest, these really aren't industry specific. I think countries will find that when you've got an ecosystem, an environment that's safe and conducive to IP protection, then you attract a lot of good things. And that could be production of chips. It could also be production of cinema. It could be production of movies and opportunities to share and amplify your culture beyond and outside of your country. And so I think one of the first things that businesses can do is to tell the story in a way that resonates with the interests of the governments that we're talking to. And by that, I think really help them to understand in meaningful terms that this really does enable people to take the leap of faith or to make the investments or to factor into these important decisions about where FDI goes, where they choose to locate organizations and create things, because it fosters a sense of security and is kind of creates a positive flywheel in terms of protection, creation, growth, and development. So one of the other things I think is really important beyond telling the story in a meaningful way, which starts with listening to the government's real needs and concerns, is also to provide technical assistance. And in the area of content protection, one example would be back to what we spoke about with the Intellectual Property Office of the Philippines, just recently signing a memorandum of understanding with the Asia Video Industry Association. What that will help them do is to collaborate on different aspects to eliminate piracy in the country. And what that will do is give some mechanisms through the legal process, through the engagement with the public, as well as other things that will help foster a healthy creative sector and help to grow that part of the economy. So that's another one. And I would think that at the end, what we really have seen is that when you get that positive dynamic between industry, community, and the government, then these benefits are really long-term, they're enduring. I'll go maybe to an example that falls outside of ASEAN, but it's probably indicative. And this is a report published by the OECD. When they looked at it, they said that countries that are more advanced and more advanced stages of developments, I should say, there's evidence that strong IP rights, having been implemented in decades previous, are associated with bigger investment and bigger FDI, imports of technology, and greater domestic innovation. So just specifically for Bangladesh, they could see that a 1% increase in protection of IP was associated with almost a 3% increase in inflows of foreign direct investment and an increase of almost 1% in domestic levels of research and development. So I think when these things are visible and they're objectively presented, I think they're powerful. And in doing that, I believe it is genuinely help to different governments in the processes. And ultimately, I guess I would end by saying, when you have a culture of content protection, you really do see the factors that are important to see: investment and economic growth. And that's a real positive story.
Great, thanks, indeed, Jared. So we are running up against the clock, I'm afraid. So what I'm going to suggest is that we have a very quick sort of lightning round, final answers. If and Joni, if you have to dash, then feel free to count yourself out of this one. But looking forward, sort of very quick responses. Where are the biggest opportunities on IP in this region? Quick answers, Joni, if you want to do one first, and then dash.
I would say very briefly, I think the opportunities lie in the multilateral agreements. Actually, the opportunities and the challenges both lie in the multilateral agreements. But we have to align ourselves and engage in these agreements, because they are gonna ensure they set the high bar for high standardization and harmonization of protection of IP in these different regions, and they set the framework for negotiating IP protections. If we move away from these agreements, that opens up the door for potential IP theft and inability to enforce property rights. So there's disincentives there for investing in R&D and innovation if that happens. We face challenges we actually can't meet and or defeat in any future global crisis, pandemic or otherwise.
That's a really important point, Joni. Thank you. I know that what's done at multilaterally and the signals that are sent are hugely important. And if we're going to beat this pandemic as well as the next one, and continue to have flourishing, digitally informed and creative economies, then the precedence and the symbolism of and enforcement of treaties is enormously important, as Katishri was saying earlier. Thanks, Joni. Feel free to depart. We really appreciated your comments. Jared, any quick final reflections on where the opportunities are?
I'll be very brief. I think Joni said it very well. International harmonization is huge, combined with domestic integration and alignment of the law plus enforcement. When you have those working together, you've got a great ecosystem to foster economic development.
Terrific. And Katishri, I'll give you the final word here, U.S. government.
Yes, I think that we need to pull in the users into the equation here, because the government and the right owners can do so much. If we educate the users to understand, the detriment of violation of IP or the benefits of using honor the IP rights, then we might have an easier job to do in the future. So we need more public awareness, users, target the users. That's all.
That's plenty. Thank you all very much indeed. This really has been a terrific discussion. I think all of these points sort of coalesce and work with one another, don't they? And we are seeing some really positive trends. And thank you all for your great work, working with governments to really capture a lot of these great opportunities and combat some of the problems. With that, I'm just going to say thank you so much to all the panelists, and turn to my colleague Patrick Kilbride, who's going to wrap up this session. But thanks again to everybody. Patrick?
Thank you, Robert, and congratulations, John, Shannon, Kelly, everyone who participated in such a terrific and substantive program. I'm Patrick Kilbride. I'm the Senior Vice President for the Global Innovation Policy Center at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And it seems I made an unwitting cameo appearance earlier in the program, so my apologies to Kelly and all of you who are listening. You know, to paraphrase an old saying, if you live by technology, you die by technology. Fortunately, though, in 2021, we very much hope to live by technology. We have seen the approval of safe and effective vaccines for the COVID pandemic, developed and tested and approved in record time, building on decades of investment in research and development, including by the private sector, and very much owed to intellectual property rules around the world that enabled the allocation of scarce financial resources to long-term, high-risk, capital-intensive activities, such as investment in biopharmaceutical progress. And what you see in the U.S. Chamber International IP Index is a roadmap to the capability to develop and produce those kind of technological advancements, whether it's in healthcare or food production or a host of other areas where we desperately need a steep trajectory of innovation to sustain a global middle class, especially during a pandemic. And you also unfortunately see a desire by many to shortcut that investment in intellectual property-led innovation, a desire to force technology transfer, to override intellectual property rights. And we know from our experience working with innovators all over the world, that is a counterproductive approach. There is no shortcut to the investment. Fortunately, we do have a roadmap in the U.S. Chamber International IP Index, and we are so grateful for the opportunity to work with leaders in Southeast Asia and around the world to help implement that roadmap. And we're very fortunate to have a Southeast Asian leader like Darren Tang at the head of the World Intellectual Property Organization, someone who, working with many of you in the region, has really put Southeast Asia on a path to be a leader in the global knowledge economy in the 21st century. So this partnership is only just begun. We look forward to many successes together in the future. Thanks again to everyone and hope to see you soon in person. Bye now.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, everybody.